What if I told you that the woman who would open the first Christian orphanage in the Egyptian desert, sheltering thousands of abandoned children over the course of her life, once stood on a dirt floor in rural Ontario, with nothing to her name but a suitcase, a Bible, and a one-way ticket she had no business buying? Her name was Mabel Rycroft, and before she became the woman who changed the lives of children no one else wanted, she was simply the daughter of a failed farmer from Napanee, Ontario, who everyone in town agreed had absolutely no future worth speaking of. She was born in 1882, the third of 7 children, in a house that groaned under the weight of too many mouths and not enough harvest. Her father, a decent man with unlucky soil, moved the family twice before Mabel was 10, first to a cousin's property outside Kingston, then further east toward the Quebec border, chasing land that might finally cooperate. It never did. By the time Mabel was 13, her father had given up farming altogether and taken a job at a textile mill in Belleville. He smelled of dye when he came home. He rarely spoke at supper. Her mother, a sharp-eyed Scottish Presbyterian woman who quoted proverbs the way other women quoted recipes, kept the household running through a combination of fierce prayer and fiercer economy. There was no money for Mabel to continue past primary school. This was simply a fact, like the cold winters and the leaking roof, something you accepted and worked around. At 15, she was helping in the mill herself, folding bolts of cotton beside women twice her age, listening to their talk, who was courting whom, who had left for Toronto, who had come back broken. She was quiet, she watched. She had the peculiar quality of seeming to disappear in a room while still noticing everything in it. She attended the local Methodist church with her mother every Sunday, and it was there at 17 that something shifted in her. Not dramatically, not in the way she had half expected such things to happen. No blinding light, no voice from the ceiling. It was quieter than that. The minister had been reading from Isaiah, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord hath anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives." And Mabel, sitting in the third pew with her hands folded in her lap, felt something she could only later describe as a door swinging open inside her chest. She did not know what was on the other side, but she knew, in that wordless, certain way that some people only experience once in a lifetime, that she was supposed to walk through it. She told no one. What was there to say? She was a mill girl from Belleville with a grade 8 education. The door, whatever it was, would have to wait. It waited 6 years. In that time, Mabel watched her older sister marry a hardware merchant and move to Peterborough. She watched 2 of her brothers leave for the West, one to Winnipeg, one to British Columbia, neither of them much interested in writing home. She saved what money she could and spent her evenings reading whatever she could borrow from the church lending library. Missionary journals, theological commentaries, travel accounts from places she could barely imagine. She read about China and India and Africa. She read about inland missions and orphan houses and hospitals built in jungles, and she felt the door inside her chest stay persistently, stubbornly open. In 1904, a woman named Ethel Crawford came to speak at the Belleville Church. She had just returned from Egypt, where she had been working with a small mission agency in Cairo. She was not a remarkable speaker. Her voice was too quiet, and she tended to lose her place in her notes. But what she described was remarkable enough to need no oratory. She talked about the streets of Cairo, where children begged at every corner. She talked about the abandoned infants left outside mosques and churches, wrapped in cloth, sometimes alive, sometimes not. She talked about the women who ran small rescue houses with almost no resources, taking in whichever children they could, doing what they could, which was never enough. After the service, Mabel waited until everyone else had finished speaking to the missionary woman. Then she walked up and stood in front of her. "I want to go," Mabel said. That was all. Ethel Crawford looked at her for a moment. "Do you have nursing training?" "No." "Teaching credentials?" "No." "Do you speak Arabic?" "No." The woman studied her. "Then you'll need to get some of those things first." That conversation should have been discouraging. Most people would have taken it as a polite dismissal. Mabel took it as a curriculum. Over the next 3 years, she enrolled in every training course she could find or afford. She took a nursing certificate through a correspondence program, and then practical training at a hospital in Toronto, where she slept in a dormitory with 12 other women, and learned to change dressings and manage fevers, and recognize the 1,000 small ways a body announces it is failing. She attended evening lectures on child welfare. She found a retired school teacher willing to tutor her in French, which was not Arabic but was a start. She wrote letters to the mission agency in Cairo, asking detailed questions about what they needed, and they wrote back, surprised and eventually impressed by her persistence. Her mother thought she was being foolish. Her father, by now slower and quieter, said he trusted her judgment. Her sister in Peterborough sent a letter saying she was praying for her, which Mabel chose to interpret as support. In 1907, at the age of 25, Mabel Rycroft boarded a ship from Halifax Harbor. She had $112 to her name, a letter of introduction from the Belleville Methodist Church, and a ticket to Alexandria. The ship's manifest listed her occupation as missionary worker. She had no salary, no organization backing her, no guaranteed housing on the other end. Several people at her church had told her gently but firmly that she was not suited for this kind of work, that it required a particular calling, a special preparation, and that she should perhaps reconsider. She had considered. She had decided. What she found in Egypt was not what she had imagined. She had imagined hardship, yes, and she had imagined purpose. What she had not imagined was confusion, the weeks of disorientation, the language that refused to resolve itself into patterns, the heat that pressed on her like a physical weight, the city noise that went on through the night and left her lying awake in a small room she shared with 2 other mission workers, wondering if she had made a catastrophic mistake. She worked for the first 8 months as an assistant in a mission school in Cairo, helping to teach basic literacy to local women and girls. It was useful work, but she felt with increasing certainty that it was not her work. The question that kept returning to her at night was the one Ethel Crawford had planted 3 years earlier. The children on the streets. Where did they go? Who was responsible for them? The answer, it turned out, was complicated. There were existing institutions, a few Coptic orphanages, a British-run home for destitute children. But they were full or selective in their intake, or located in the city in ways that made them inaccessible to the children in the rural areas south of Cairo. The Fellahin villages along the Nile had their own abandoned children, their own orphans, and almost no infrastructure to care for them. She began making trips south on weekends with a small team of local women she had befriended. They brought food, basic medicines, cloth. They found children in states of neglect that she would later describe in her letters home only in general terms, because the specifics were too difficult to put into words. She brought 2 children back to Cairo with her on one of these trips and housed them in her own room, a decision that her supervisor at the mission school found irregular and her roommates found generous, if impractical. By 1910, she had moved out of the mission school entirely. She had rented a modest house on the edge of a village called Kirkira, about 40 kilometers south of Cairo, using money she had borrowed from a handful of supporters in Canada who had been receiving her letters and were moved enough to send what they could. The house had 3 rooms, a courtyard, and a persistent problem with the roof. She moved in with 6 children. Within a year there were 22. The work was ordinary in the way that all hard things eventually become ordinary if you do them long enough. She rose before dawn. She organized the feeding, the washing, the schooling that happened in the courtyard under a tarp strung between 2 palm trunks. She treated illness with the nursing knowledge she had and sought out doctors from Cairo when she ran out of that knowledge. She wrote letters, an astonishing number of letters, to churches in Ontario and Manitoba and Nova Scotia, explaining what she was doing and asking for help. The letters were plain and specific. She did not dramatize. She simply described how many children, what they needed, what it cost, what would happen if the money did not come. The money came, slowly, inconsistently, sometimes in amounts so small she would cry a little in the evening and then be ashamed of herself and write another letter the next morning. But it came. What she had not counted on was how public the work would become. A Canadian journalist traveling through Egypt in 1913 came to Kirkira after hearing about her from a contact in Cairo. He spent 2 days there and wrote a piece for a Toronto newspaper that described what he found with some accuracy and considerable sentiment. The article mentioned Mabel by name. It described the orphanage. She had never called it that, but the name stuck. And it described the children and their various circumstances, and it described Mabel herself in terms she found both embarrassing and slightly inaccurate. But it brought donations. More significantly, it brought attention from a women's missionary society in Hamilton, Ontario, that had been looking for a project to support. They contacted her directly. They committed to monthly giving. They sent 2 young women to help her. They eventually sent 4 more. By 1916, when Mabel was 34, the Kirkira house had expanded into 3 adjacent buildings and was caring for 89 children. She had a small staff. 2 Canadian women, several Egyptian women from the village. A Coptic Christian man named Farouk who managed the finances with a patience that she suspected was supernatural. She had established a small school that served children from the surrounding villages, not just her own orphans. She had negotiated with local officials, sometimes successfully and sometimes not, always stubbornly. She had buried 11 children in those years, and she counted each one a wound that did not quite heal. There was a morning in the winter of 1917 that she would later speak about in the rare occasions when she was asked to speak. It was early, before the children were up, and she had gone out to the courtyard with her Bible and her tea as she did most mornings. There was a particular child she was worried about, a girl of about 4 who had come to them 3 weeks earlier in very poor condition and had not been improving as Mabel had hoped. She sat in the courtyard in the cold morning air and found that she had no words for her prayer. She simply sat there, holding the Bible and the tea, and was aware of being completely overwhelmed by the need around her, by the weight of it, by the acute consciousness of how insufficient she was. And then, as she would describe it, nothing happened. There was no voice, no vision, no warmth in the chest. There was just the courtyard and the cold air and the sound of the Nile somewhere to the west and the knowledge, settling into her slowly, that she did not have to be sufficient. She had never been sufficient. The work had never depended on her sufficiency. She was, at most, a match, and matches do not need to be the fire. The girl recovered. Mabel stayed in Egypt for 41 years. She returned to Canada 3 times. Once for her father's funeral in 1921, once for her mother's in 1934, once for a speaking tour in 1938 that she found exhausting and returned from as quickly as she could manage. Canada had become, in her perception, a place she was from rather than a place she belonged to. Egypt had a different claim on her. By the time the Second World War reached Egypt's borders, the orphanage at Kirkira had become something rather different from what it had been. Larger, more formal, connected to a small clinic that served the surrounding communities. The war years were difficult. Supply lines that had been unreliable became nearly impossible. They spent a significant portion of those years in correspondence with mission boards and donors, managing logistics with the same plain stubbornness she had always applied to everything. She grew old there. This is not a dramatic thing to say. It is simply what happened. The children she had raised grew up, and some of them came back. As teachers, as nurses, as mothers who brought their own children to see the place where they had been given a chance. She watched this and was, she admitted, surprised by it every time. She had not thought that far ahead in 1907. She had thought only about the next month, the next letter, the next child. There is a letter she wrote to a supporter in Winnipeg in 1944, when she was 62 years old. It is preserved in the archives of the Missionary Society that had supported her for 30 years by then. In it, she writes about a young woman named Dina, who had come to Kirkira as an infant with no known family, and who had just been married to a schoolteacher from a village 3 kilometers away. Mabel had attended the wedding. She writes about it the way she wrote about everything, plainly, specifically, what color the bride wore, what they ate, how the groom's family received Dina, who had no family of her own to bring to the ceremony, except, as the letter notes, the staff and older children of the orphanage who came and stood on one side of the courtyard so that the groom's family would see that she came with people who loved her. She does not editorialize. She does not draw a lesson from it. She simply describes what she saw. Mabel Rycroft died in 1948. In the same village she had moved to 40 years earlier. She was 66 years old. Her death was quiet, attended by the Egyptian women who had worked alongside her for decades, and by 2 Canadian missionaries who happened to be nearby. She had been ill for several months and had continued working through most of it, because she had never really found another mode. At her death, the Kirkira home was caring for 147 children. Over the course of her 41 years in Egypt, she had taken in more than 2,000. She had started with $112 and a one-way ticket. She had no credentials. She was not a trained theologian. She spoke Arabic with a noticeable accent until the end. Several church committees over the years had expressed doubts about the regularity of her approach, her governance structures, her theological precision. She was, in their view, the wrong person for the work. She was, in everyone else's view, simply the person who showed up and did not stop. There is something about that that deserves to sit with you. Not the heroism of it, though it was quietly heroic, but the ordinariness of the beginning. A mill girl in Belleville. A door that opened inside her chest during an Isaiah reading. A question she could not stop asking about children no one else was asking about. History tends to remember the revival speakers and the theologians and the institution builders. It does not always remember the women who rose before dawn in a village on the edge of the desert and made sure 89 children ate breakfast. But perhaps this is the deeper story, that the kingdom of God has always moved forward on exactly this kind of faithfulness. Unspectacular, persistent, completely dependent on a grace that is not the worker's own. You don't need to have all the answers before you begin. You don't need credentials to be called. Mabel didn't. She had a question, an open door, and the willingness to walk through it without being sure of what was on the other side. If there is something pulling at you, a door you've been aware of, a question you can't stop asking, perhaps the only thing left to do is take the next step. Not the whole journey, just the next step. That was, in the end, what Mabel Rycroft did. One step at a time for 41 years, in a village 40 kilometers south of Cairo, for children whose names almost no one now remembers, though she remembered every one of them right to the end.